Alright, so for these last tissue types, I'm actually going to combine them together since they're shorter than the others. So we're going to look at both muscle tissue as well as nervous tissue for this last video. So let's go ahead and start with muscle tissue first. And so we're going to talk about the three major types of muscle and then talk about each, compare, contrast the functions, as well as talk about some of the characteristics that'll help us identify them under the microscope. And then we'll talk about how muscle tissue helps us move. How does it actually allow us to create motion? So muscle tissue has a couple properties that allow for movement. One, they're excitable, which means they can respond to a stimulus. We're not going to get caught up in the detail right now over that, but that's one of the big things is that they respond to a stimulus. And when they respond, they do so through their second property, which is their ability to contract. When they contract, they actually physically shorten, and when they shorten, it generates a pulling force. So kind of like if you were to pull on a rope. One of the big things, though, is that when muscles contract, they pull, but they do not push, right? You don't push with a muscle. It's kind of like you don't push with a rope. You can pull with a rope, but you can't push with a rope. Muscle tissues can be voluntary or involuntary, meaning if it's voluntary, you have conscious control over it. You can think about what you're doing. So I'm thinking about and consciously choosing to use the muscles to speak right now, right? To move my mouth and to move my hands. You can't see it, but I talk with my hands, so I'm doing that in the background as well. That's all voluntary. I'm consciously able to decide to use my muscles in that way. Involuntary means I don't have to think about it. I can do it in my sleep if I need to. So you think about like your heart muscle. You wouldn't want your heart muscle to be voluntary, right? You would want your heart muscle to be going on and contracting and relaxing without you ever having to think about it. So voluntary, you have conscious control. Involuntary, the control over it is subconscious. You can't actually, you're not actually consciously making that decision to contract that muscle. So we're going to talk about the three major types, which is skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. We're going to look at their structure as well as their functions and where to find them. So here are our three different types. So at the very top, we have our skeletal muscle. Very, very top. We have our smooth muscle in the middle, and then our cardiac muscle down here at the very, very bottom. All right, and so we'll have each of these pictures on the slides where we talk about each, so you don't have to necessarily memorize them, and we don't have to go back and forth here. So let's go forward and talk about skeletal muscle first. So skeletal muscle is found attached to bones, hence the name skeletal muscle. This is voluntary. This is the only muscle that is voluntary, meaning you have conscious control over it. You can choose to hop on one foot. You can choose to move your hands. You can choose to do, use these muscles in various ways to conduct your daily life. And so if we look at them, we see striations. These are basically like little stripes, right? And so if we look closely, and I know it's a little hard to see here, but you'll see it again in the lab, but you see it almost looks like it's a little blurry, right? Like it's like a TV screen that's not quite set right, where you see these little lines. Those are the striations going down. And each of these long, lean fibers is one muscle cell. But you'll notice we have all these purple dots. Each purple dot is a nucleus. So this is a multinucleated muscle cell. It's the only multinucleated muscle cell. So that's another thing if you're trying to figure it out, looking at it on a lab exam or something, looking at this and going, okay, I see all the nuclei. I have to be looking at skeletal muscle. So the way I like to describe it, long and lean, striated, multinucleated. You got those things down, you can identify skeletal muscle. We use this for locomotion, so being able to move from one place to another, for our facial expressions, keeping our posture, as well as other voluntary movements. So like, if you're trying to make something or you're talking, things like that, skeletal muscle is fantastic for that. Cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is found in one place and one place only. It is found in your heart, hence the name cardiac muscle. So we find this in the parts of the heart that actually contract so that you have a heartbeat. This is involuntary, right? You don't have to think about it. And that's a good thing, right? Because if you would have to think about making your heartbeat every time you made your heartbeat, sleep would be extremely difficult, right? So we don't have to think about our heart beating. It will beat regularly our entire lives, right? It is also striated, so I know the picture's a little blurry, but we can see some striations there, just like we did with the skeletal muscle. But one big thing is that we only have one nucleus, right? There's only one nucleus there, so that's a big difference. And if you notice, we're not long and lean anymore. We're actually branching a little bit, so we'll have some branches here and there. And then we're connected. If you look, these cardiomyocytes, which are the cardiac muscle cells, are connected by what we call intercalated discs. And so you'll notice that there's occasionally one striation that looks darker than the rest, and that's the intercalated disc, and it's filled with gap junctions. Remember, we talked about gap junctions not too long ago. Gap junctions will provide a space for rapid communication, which if you are a heart cell, a heart muscle cell, you need to coordinate your contraction with all the heart muscle cells around you. And so rapid communication, extremely important to be able to beat regularly and with a rhythm. So intercalated discs, or something that looks like a very dark striation, is going to help with that communication. So this would be our cardiac muscle. Again, we have striations, we have one single nucleus, we have some branching, and we have intercalated discs. Right, so here's a nice little picture showing those. So in this case, we look at the intercalated discs that are around there. Again, under the microscope, it'll look like a striation that's just darker than the rest of them around it. And that's where those cells come into contact. They have those gap junctions again. So we have the desmosomes that actually link them so they stay adhered to each other. Remember, one of those junctions, those junctions that helps connect cells to cells, but we have gap junctions too for rapid communication. Right? That's super, super, super important that we can talk to each other very, very quickly. And then the last one, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is called smooth muscle because we don't see striations at all. They don't exist. We tend to have a spindle shape. I know it's kind of hard to tell, but they tend to have like a long, kind of lean spindle shape. And again, one single nucleus, right? Another big thing that we notice there. Smooth muscle is also involuntary. Again, you don't want to have to think about this because this is going to be the muscle we use like in our digestive system, our urinary system, the reproductive systems, in your arteries and whatnot. So I mean, you wouldn't want to have to think about that, right? You wouldn't want to have to think about having to move the food through your digestive system. That would not be fun. We also see it in your eyes, so to change the shape of your iris or your lens. So again, visual accommodation is able to occur. So you can change those shapes to be able to change your focus on near versus far, or to allow different levels of light in based on the light that's available. You don't have to think about that. Right, and the same thing on your skin that causes the hair to stand up, the erector pili muscles. So when you're like cold, you get goosebumps, or you don't have to think about causing goosebumps. They're just going to happen, right? You don't have to actually put that effort in. If you're cold, you're going to get goosebumps. Your hair is going to stand up regardless. All right, moving on to the last of the four, nervous tissue, and then we'll be done with this particular chapter. So we're going to talk about some of the classes of cells that make up nervous tissue, and then also talk about how nervous tissue mediates perception and response. So we might not get to all these things in this particular lecture, but these are things you should be able to accomplish in lecture on your own in terms of studying and whatnot. So what are some things that nervous tissue has to be able to do? It has to be excitable. We talked about this with muscle too, right? Muscle has to be excitable. It has to be able to respond to something. But the response is different, right? Because remember, muscle tissue responded by contracting. Nervous tissue responds by sending and receiving electrochemical signals. And when you get to physiology, you'll talk about this in depth of how these signals, these electrochemical signals work. There's two main types of cells we find in nervous tissue. Neurons, these are the cells that actually do the communicating, and neuroglia, which help support the neurons. And the neuroglia are going to outnumber the neurons about 9-to-1 or so. Neurons, though, they need a lot of help. They need their cheerleaders. So what do we see? So the neurons are these big guys, right? These big guys here all over. And all these other little itty bitties are the neuroglia. And there's different types of neuroglia, and we'll get into that in just a second. But we see the size comparison alone is pretty big. Right? The neurons are massive in comparison to the neuroglia. So let's talk about the neuron first. The neuron has a very typical shape. There's different shapes, there's different types of neurons, but this is our generic neuron. And really there's a few main parts. We have the dendrites that receive an electrochemical signal. We have a cell body, also called a soma sometimes, and that contains the nucleus. And this is going to be what kind of decides like what to do. This is where like the decision is made of how do we respond to the signal we receive. And then the long tail here is the axon with all these little tendrils at the end, the axon terminal. And this is what's going to carry a signal away from the cell to talk to another neuron or talk to another body part. So the axon carries a signal away. The A alliteration may help you. Right? And then these little tendrils at the end of the axon, what we call the axon terminal, is going to be what communicates with those other cells. So nice and neat here, but when you look at it, it's kind of, a little bit different. And you can see the extensions coming off. It's not as clear in terms of dendrite versus axon in this slide here, but you can kind of see those extensions kind of branching off. All right, we'll talk more about different types of neurons in neuroglia when we get to the nervous system too, so we don't want to worry too much about it just yet. So let's go on and talk about what happens with tissues in terms of injury and aging. And again, we're lumping this in because it's a relatively short section, so we don't want to get caught up making a million itty-bitty videos. So let's talk about tissue injury and aging. What happens to tissues if something goes wrong, right? If there's some sort of injury, some sort of problem, how do we fix it? And then what happens as we get older, right? And these are things you're going to have to think about. We're not going to get super in-depth with this, so you will have to do some of this on your own in terms of reading, but we'll at least cover some of the main bullet points. So let's talk about tissue injury and repair. So we can't talk about this without talking about inflammation. And usually when you hear inflammation, you're thinking bad, right? You're thinking this is harmful, this is not good. But inflammation is actually a response triggered by your own immune system. So acute inflammation or inflammation that happens in the short term is absolutely part of the healing process. But inflammation in the long run, chronic inflammation, that can be a problem. Right? So again, this is a normal response to any sort of injury, infection, something along those lines. It's part of your immune response. It's part of your initial response if you were to get hurt or infected. And this is because it's going to help limit the injury, limit how far the injury goes. It's going to help repair and regenerate the damaged tissue as well. Sometimes, though, we have, let's say you get an injury, a cut, something like that. We have necrosis. This is accidental cell death. This causes inflammation because the internal components of the cell have actually spilled out and are causing havoc, right? It's not normal for a cell to spill all of its contents out into the space around it. So that's going to cause your body to react. Apoptosis, though, the programmed cell death, does not cause inflammation because apoptosis is a controlled demolition of a cell. We're actually going to break down into pockets called blebs, and that is the actual name, that will slowly break down in a more controlled manner. So it's important to note when we're talking about inflammation and cell death, we're usually talking about something like an accident or an injury, right? And there's four main parts of inflammation. There's redness, swelling, pain, and heat. Any area that's inflamed, you'll notice that it's pink or red compared to the tissue around it. This can appear a little bit different, though, in skin that is containing more melanin. So in people of color, that redness may not appear exactly the same, and that's important to note. But the rest would be generally the same no matter what. Where we have swelling, the area is going to be appear larger and more stiff and more full. There's usually pain associated with this, and then the area will feel warmer to the touch compared to the tissue around it. So let's talk about what is going on here when tissue heals. So we get a cut, right? Some sort of cut occurs, some sort of damage. The first thing that's going to happen is we are going to have a clot form, right? So clotting proteins, plasma proteins, platelets are all going to come along here and form a scab. We have inflammatory chemicals that are released from the injured tissues as well as from some of the immune cells that are in the area. White blood cells are actually going to appear. Now, we talked about like the swelling and the heat, And why do we experience that? Well, because one of the chemicals that's released is going to actually cause, it's going to make it easier for white blood cells to actually escape from the blood stream and get into the tissue. So it's going to make these blood vessels more permeable. And so with that, we have a whole bunch of more cells and fluid flooding into the area. That's going to create the swelling because we have more fluid, more substance than normal. And the heat, because that blood, that fluid is carrying body heat with it. So it's going to feel warmer because of that as well. But we want to have that swelling. We want to have that heat because that means that the cells that are going to help with the repair process are arriving, right? They're actually flooding into the area. They're going to arrive in there. They're going to, if there's any sort of bacteria that have been introduced, the white blood cells can take care of that. And then in the meantime, right, we have fibroblasts, right? Like if we're looking in the dermis here, that are going to start secreting and creating, tissues to repair the damage as the scab is kind of disappearing, right? Because the epithelial tissue on the very top here in the epidermis, it's going to replace itself. And so that's going to slowly push the wound in the epidermis up towards the surface. The deeper part has to repair itself from within, right? So the dermis will repair itself within. Usually we end up seeing extra fibers like collagen and whatnot, which means it's going to create some scar tissue right underneath. Because it will not repair itself perfectly the way it was. As the damage is controlled, right, swelling can go down, redness will go down. The pain is because that extra fluid, that extra pressure is putting pressure on free nerve endings that will trigger pain. But that will go down as the wound is being healed. And then over time, we've repaired everything. We have the scar tissue underneath because, again, it's not perfect. We just kind of have to do a rush job in repairing that tissue. It's going to mature, it's going to contract, we'll replace things, but generally speaking, we're left with a little bit of scar tissue where there's just extra fibers and whatnot in that area.